Thank you for coming. I appreciate that you're here. This is very important. These are meetings, public meetings that we're doing, part of, I'll explain, the rollout of the proposed tuition schedule. This is a proposal. It's not what we're planning to do yet. And as we move forward, we may make modifications, as I'll explain. This is the tuition proposal for 2017-18 through spring 2020. The year coming up is already part of the current tuition schedule, so it's important that we understand that this is a proposal for the year after next. So what I'm going to do in the presentation today is we're going to talk about, real briefly, the schedule and the process. Then we'll talk about goals, parameters, and considerations in terms of setting the tuition. What we would do with the tuition revenues that we would get from an increase. We'll go over the proposal and then just summarize very quickly. There will be an opportunity at the end for testimony or clarifying questions. The intent is not to debate the merits of the proposal, but to gather feedback. So you'll have an opportunity. In terms of the schedule, this is essentially how the tuition proposal schedule is developed. Back in the fall, we started talking about whether or not we needed a tuition increase, what the tuition increase would be used for, what our priorities, our goals were. We did the research, policy review, those kinds of things. In January, I did a presentation to the Board of Regents in terms of a tuition setting discussion. What are some of the things we're considering? What do we need to consider? Feedback from the board. February, we went back to the board with the presentation of what the proposal is before we went out for community meetings for feedback. We're in the proposal distribution period right now. The meetings will go through the first week of May, and then we'll use the month of May to do revisions based on feedback that we get. And at that point, we're intending to take the presentation back to the board for consideration and action in June. That's the current schedule. And then for filing, if it's approved with the Lieutenant Governor, sometime before fall, ideally June, July, in that time period. So when we look at the tuition setting process, the purpose of today's meeting is to share a draft proposal and get feedback from you all. You all will have the opportunity to provide feedback and your thoughts. At the very end of the presentation is an email address and a website, so if things occur to you later or you don't feel comfortable talking today about what your feedback is, then we'll be collecting it all along. Written testimony is also accepted. All testimony will be forwarded to the Board of Regents and to the UH administration for consideration in the final proposal. We will likely modify the proposal based on feedback, and then the final proposal will be presented to the board for approval in June 2016. So we do have handouts now. I just see them coming in of the proposal so that you can go along if you'd like. So when we talk about setting tuition and what some of the things that we're considering is we look at the goals, parameters, and the considerations. The goals moving forward are to ensure access to public higher education for every qualified Hawaii resident. So everyone who's qualified and a resident of Hawaii should have access to keep the college affordable and to modernize facilities in campus environments to be safe, sustainable, and supportive environments for teaching, learning, and research practices. So these are the goals moving forward in terms of what we're thinking. I'm so happy to see students here. Please come sit down. So further parameters and considerations, Regents Policy 6.202 suggests that we are to ensure that every qualified Hawaii resident shall have an opportunity to pursue post-secondary education within the university system. There is a companion executive policy that also suggests that when we go out for tuition setting procedures, that we do public notification, that students and others are given timely notice and the explanation, and that there's an opportunity to provide feedback in terms of moving forward with the proposals. When we look at specifically what we need to consider in setting tuition, the Regents policy gives us 5 variables or 5 topic areas that I will go over in this presentation. So this is going to be the structure of the first part of the presentation. The first one is relative standing in terms of like institutions. Who are our comparison institutions, and how much do they charge? Are we in the same ballpark? The second one is differential rates across the units. There are 4 units, for those of you who are not aware of that. We break down into units Manoa, which is the flagship institution. Hilo and West Oahu are considered the comprehensive, so that's 3 of the units, and the community colleges are considered a unit by themselves. So those are the 4 units, to make sure that the tuition rates are evenly distributed, that they make sense across the units. The third is accessibility and mix of students. We have certain student groups that we track, those with historically low college going rates or completion rates, to make sure that we are not leaving students behind, that we're not inadvertently preventing students from having access based on ethnic background, income levels, whether they're residents, non-residents, those variables. The fourth one is financial aid availability and use, to ensure that we have enough financial aid available for students to have access. And then the fifth one is the cost of education and the sharing of that cost between students and the general public. So what many people don't understand is that revenue for education comes from 2 places, only 2 places. It comes from, for public institutions, it comes either through some type of legislative support or from students, from tuition. Those are the only 2 what we would call baseline revenue sources that would ensure the ability to run the institution. And so we'll go over those numbers too. So when we look at relative standing in terms of tuition at like institutions of higher education, how do we compare? That's the big question. So we see, if we take Manoa, we pulled them out as a flagship, and then we also have what we call the WICHE numbers. WICHE is the Western group of institutions that we generally compare ourselves with. There are 2 comparison groups. One is WICHE and the other one is IPED. But if your friends or your neighbors or your family members want to go off to college, most of them are more likely to go to a WICHE school. These are the schools also where they offer like 1.5 times the WUI rate, 1.5 times tuition to attend the schools, and we also allow that rate. We're part of that group. One of the things I'd like to point out here, so this is a percentage of where we are in WICHE medians in the 2015-16 year. One of the things I'd like to point out here, having taught research methods and statistics, is this does not mean that we're 107% above the median. That's what some people sometimes look at that. It suggests that we're slightly above the median. If the median is 100%, we see that at Manoa, we're about 107% of the median, which means we're right in the middle for flagship institutions. When you come over here to the community colleges, we see that we're, for in-state resident students, we're right about 104%. We're right there. We're right in the middle. We also see that for non-resident students, the numbers are much higher, particularly at the 2 comprehensives, at Hilo and West Oahu. When I did this at Manoa yesterday, I kind of blew through the community college numbers because those students are not going to be going to community college. But ideally, the community college students are going to be going to either Manoa or West Oahu and Hilo. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on those numbers too, because there are consequences and implications for the students here. So one of the things we do, this is a comparison for Manoa. We don't have these numbers for the community colleges and for the comprehensives, but when you look at how we compare nationally, I just want to point this out, this is one of the other things we look at is, the red line is the average for the US, the yellow line is Hawaiʻi, and the green average is the WICHE number. So even for Manoa, we're a little high, but we're kind of still in the middle, in the ballpark in terms of where we are compared to, actually this is national, to all the states in the nation. And this is for undergraduate, so resident and non-resident. When we get to graduate tuition, we see a different picture. We see that it's a little more expensive. We're much closer, actually for you all, to the right side of the chart. So for instance, for resident graduate students, the U.S. average is about $11,800 for public institutions. For Hawaiʻi, it's $14,048. This is the average because we've got the 2 schools with graduate enrollments in them. When we get to non-residents, the numbers move all the way over, and we see that we're very, very high for graduate out-of-state students. It's an alarming number, but it's not that alarming because the majority of these students, majority of our out-of-state graduate students don't pay tuition. They come here and they get teaching assistantships, graduate assistantships, and tuition waivers. So it's a very high number. We want to bring it down because it keeps us from being competitive. But also keep in mind that with the exception of the professional schools, which are business, the law school, and the medical school, we're not, and those are the big ones, students aren't paying these rates. So how do we compare on island? What we've got is the private institutions on the island, and then the UH resident and the UH non-resident rates. So we see that HBU and Chaminade are still significantly more expensive than for resident tuition, and actually only less expensive when we get to non-resident tuition from Manoa. So that's where we're losing, is for non-resident students at Manoa. We're much more expensive than the other options on the island. And UH is cheaper, with the only exception of if you are an LDS student at Brigham Young. If you go to BYU and you're a member of the church, then it's much, much cheaper than if you want to come to UH or go to one of the other institutions. So when we consider this data, what are we to make of it? What are some of the conclusions? Well, we see that resident tuition is at or slightly above the medians for comparable institutions. Non-resident tuition is significantly or meaningfully above in some areas. But that, and actually one of the things that we did put in here is that tuition is also higher at some of the professional schools. So we want to hold the professional schools out, we're thinking. So the conclusion is how we compare price-wise to our comparable institutions should not be a significant consideration in establishing a resident tuition rate. We're not out of the median area, and so raising tuition should not be a consideration whether we do it or not based on how we compare, but non-resident tuition should be. We want to think about non-resident tuition and professional school tuition because too high amount is going to disadvantage us in terms of competition, being competitive with our peers. So the second one, and I'll go through this one very quickly because we're going to see that there's not much to deal with here, is differential tuition rates by unit. We want to make sure that we're appropriately differentiated. So here are the numbers based on this coming year's tuition, so academic year 2016-17, so fall of next year, through spring of next year. We see that Hilo and West Oahu now are the same, which is what happened with this current tuition schedule. Community colleges are significantly less expensive than the other two, and that the flagship is the most expensive, which is what you would expect. When I show this slide, I like to point out something that became apparent when we first started showing it. The one slash at the top is to let you all know that we're using 12 credit hours for the full-time rate for community colleges. And we do that because 12 credit hours is considered full-time, but at community colleges, students pay more based on the number of credits that they take. But actually, I'm going to pick on Chair Moore for a minute because I think it was you who asked me, why are we using 12 credit hours when 15 is full-time? And I was very proud of that, made me very happy because I realized how successful, at that moment, how successful our 15 to finish campaign had been. That people, and I've been asked that question in the meantime, that people are now thinking about 15 credit hours as full-time, which if students take 15 credit hours, particularly at the 4 years, mostly at the 4 years, they pay no more money after 12 credit hours. They're going to get through faster and less expensively. It can make a big difference in terms of saving at least a semester's worth of tuition for them. So the differential tuition rates, the tuitions are appropriately differentiated by mission, level, and residency status. With the current tuition schedule, the two comprehensives are costing the same. So we don't think that there is any need to mess with the differential tuition. So we'll move past this one. So accessibility and mix of students. How are we affecting students' ability for access based on the tuition raises? These are charts. This is a chart going back to 2006, and you see when we started raising tuition that there was a spike in Pell recipients, which is what we would hope to see. The groups that we tend to follow to make sure that there's access and we're not leaving students behind are Pell students, Filipino students, Hawaiian, part Hawaiian students, and Pacific Islanders. One of the things I'm pointing out in these presentations that's very important is it's very good that the Pell numbers are going up, because Pell is federal financial aid. It's money that students do not have to pay back. They are not loans, they're grants, and it's the more Pell grants that we get, the more Pell money that we get, the more money we have, internal money, to allocate to students for state financial aid or for tuition funded financial aid. So it's really good that we've been able to spike, and it makes sense that the numbers started going up when the tuition went up. But the tuition increases have not seemed to have had a big impact on access for these groups of students. And the Hawaiʻi DOE numbers also seem to indicate that the percentage of these students as a percentage of their graduating class and a percentage of the students coming into the UH have not been affected by tuition increases. So essentially, that's what I just said. We're finding that the tuition increase has not had a significant impact. We've made really good progress in terms of getting Pell grants. And we continue to need to work on reducing the enrollment gaps of underrepresented groups. So we must continue to explore solutions, particularly at the four-year institutions, to make sure that the students transfer, articulate, and stay in. So financial aid availability and use. Hawaii is one of the only states I'm aware of that does not have a state-funded financial aid program. So tuition is an important source of financial aid. There's an executive policy that suggests that a minimum amount of tuition money must be set aside for financial aid, need-based financial aid. At Manoa, it's a minimum of 10%. My understanding it's closer to 20% is being held back. Hilo and West Oahu, minimum of 12%. According to Chancellor's training at Hilo, it's closer to 20% at Hilo. In community colleges, it's a minimum of 8.8% of tuition money that's held back that goes back to students for financial aid. So how much financial aid do we give? These are the numbers from 2009-10 to this last year, the year before this one. You can see that tuition-funded financial aid is responsible for almost $47 million of financial aid across the system. That's a lot of access. The blue numbers, or the blue bar, is for the 4 years, and then on my screen it's orange, but I think it might be yellow on yours. It's about $6.3 million. The line at the top is enrollment. So enrollment dipped a little bit, but we were still able to give more financial aid. This is all coming from tuition. Pell Grants have increased significantly, and you see tuition compared to Pell Grants. In 2015, we got $66 million in Pell Grants. It's $66 million of federal money that students applied for and were given that helped offset the cost of education. So these two numbers are the aid that's been given to students in terms of helping them get in and stay in college. So the question becomes for a lot of people, well, tuition's expensive, school is expensive, it's quite an investment. How much does it cost our students, and what are they left with in terms of debt? So one of the things we track in my area is student debt, and we see that pretty consistently from about 2010. Students at 4 years graduate with about $20,000, $22,000 worth of debt. This is debt that we can follow, loans, college loans. And at the community colleges, it's right around $12,000 now. It's gone from about $10,000 to $12,000. It dipped there for a while. How does this compare to the rest of the country? How does this compare with our peers? And so we've done that analysis. We don't have the analysis for IPED's peers for the community colleges or West Oahu, but we know the percentages of students who come out with debt, college-related debt, and the numbers at Manoa and Hilo. And you can see from this chart that our students actually take on slightly less debt at slightly lower numbers than they do across the country. And for the community colleges, it's a relatively low number. We don't know what the national number is for community colleges, but I can't imagine that it's a whole lot lower than 19% of the students who graduate or complete community college with debt. So if you see our IPED's peers, 58% of students in similar institutions to Manoa graduate with debt, with an average of $24,000. Students ideally should be able to get through school without debt. but it's one of those things that we have to compare and say, okay, so are we pushing our students into a place where they have to take on more debt to get through school? So considering financial aid availability and use, the utilization of Pell Grants has increased significantly, and that's a good thing. We need to continue to push that. We need to have students fill out the FAFSA and fill it out every year so that they continue to get the aid, which gives them more support, but also frees up support for us to give more support to more students. There remains unmet direct cost need that we're aware of in terms of tuition, books, fees, that ideally should be met through scholarships and grants rather than loans. We need to work with students to do that. And then we need to consider financial aid for the GAP students, what we call the GAP students, the students who don't qualify for financial aid because either they or their families make just a little bit too much money, but still don't make enough money to go to school full time. So, and I've been identifying myself in that group. It took me a long time to get through college because I had to work and go to school and work and go to school. It takes a long time. We know that those students are very likely to just stop out completely because they just run out of steam. So we need to be very mindful of who these GAP students are and make sure that we're reaching out to them with the appropriate levels of aid also. So the conclusion is we must commit not only to tuition-funded scholarships and financial aid, but we must also focus on other forms of financial aid to make sure that we're ensuring access and that students can continue to get their education. So when you get to the cost of education and the sharing of that cost, remember I said that tuition comes from, or not tuition, operating costs for institutions tends to come from one of two places. In publicly funded higher ed, it's either the government or the students. One of the reasons that tuition has gone up across the nation in the last 10 years, as high as it has, is because states have stopped funding their institutions. And I get news about this across my desk almost every day because of the organizations that I'm a member of. But I think California at this point is still going up 5% for the next 3 years after this. I don't know if any of you follow the news, but one of the things that California came across my desk last week is they actually had huge pushback, and I don't know if somebody filed something, but California was not accepting resident students, they were accepting non-resident students and pushing out resident students because they said they could not afford to educate their resident students, that they weren't getting enough money. So there's just been some money given to the Cal States with the promise, not the Cal States, I'm sorry, the UCs, with the promise that they will again start accepting more resident students. Bottom line is money comes from two places. It comes from appropriations or it comes from students. And then students can get money from the federal government through Pell Grants and those things. So sources of operating revenues, general funds and tuition. Where does the money come from? We look from fiscal year 08 through what we project to be fiscal year 17. The blue bar is the amount of general funds that we've gotten, and the orange bar is the amount of tuition money. And you can see that the amount of tuition money has increased quite a bit, almost to the point where it's not quite half and half. It's probably just slightly under 2/3 and 1/3. I had a question yesterday about, well, it looks like that the federal or the state money has stayed pretty constant, but tuition's rising. Why is that true? The value of the dollar has changed. So the dollar today is worth less than it was, let's say, in fiscal year 12. I think somebody sent me the numbers. You can look it up, but we don't have the buying power, we still have the costs. This is why, even though the numbers have come down and they've stayed down, in terms of operating costs, it's cost us more money to run the institutions. When you look at operating revenues, one of the questions we got when we first took this out was, where does the money go? How do institutions spend the money? So I'm going to go through this and then focus on the community colleges real quickly. So this is Manoa. You see that there's a 54-46% split between general funds and tuition. Huge amount of the money goes for personnel and electricity. We have very high electricity costs in the state. Similar for Hilo, West Oahu, although West Oahu gets way more general funds than tuition. And community colleges, same thing, way more general funds than tuition. Personnel costs are larger. Electricity is about $10.8 million a year. And then the institutions are run off of about $24.6 million is what the expenses and expenditures are after personnel. In terms of educational appropriations per student, when you look at how much states give for students, so per FTE, full-time equivalent, this is what the funding changes have been from 2008 to 2014, which is the most recent national data, for the percent of money that's dropped for what states allocate. So we see over here with Hawaii, with the yellow, that we've lost 25.7% in appropriations for education. So Hawaii has cut over 25% the amount of money they've given to higher education. The average nationally is 13.3. I've been pointing out Alaska, North Dakota, and Illinois over here. Illinois increased, and the other ones increased, but Illinois is having some real issues now, and these other two are oil states, so I would imagine if we went back and looked at them right now, it would be a different story, because Alaska and North Dakota don't have the oil revenues that they had before. Another thing we look at is the percentage that a student pays for the tuition. How much of the tuition does the student pay versus the state? And we see that for those same years, well actually this is fiscal 2014, the U.S. average was 47%, that students paid about 47% of the cost of educating them. In Hawaii, you see that students pay about 34% of the cost of educating them. And I've got some charts in a minute that break it down even further. And then the WICHE average is 43.7, just under 44% of the cost of what it costs to educate a specific student is what the student is paying. So average expenditures per full-time students. We see at Manoa for fiscal year 2015 that it costs on average $31,413 to educate a full-time student. Of that, the student paid $9,840. And so this is what the current breakdown is between what the student pays and what the state pays. For the community colleges, the average was $14,480 per student, and the student paid $2,736 to be educated. And we've got the other numbers, and these are all in the handout, so I'm not going to go through all of them. So what we find is that in the last decade, Hawaii experienced one of the largest drops in appropriations for higher education. But Hawaii also continues to be relatively well funded compared to other states across the nation. We anticipate that the funding levels are going to remain constant, that the amount of money that we get from the legislature is not going to go up or go down, but we're hoping that it remains at least constant. We're committed to keeping costs low for students. However, when we started thinking about what our needs are, we realized that we have system-wide a $500 million backlog in deferred maintenance that is not ever getting addressed. We're not getting legislative money for it. We have no other way to deal with it. So we started thinking, okay, this is probably our greatest need. How do we deal with the deferred maintenance backlog across the system? So that brings me to the part of the presentation that talks about how we would use new tuition revenues. It's a 3-year deferred maintenance strategy. So here are the basic goals. At Manoa, the money over 3 years will be used to reduce the deferred maintenance backlog using revenue bonds. We would take the money generated and use it to purchase revenue bonds. And I'll talk about that, how that might work in a minute. For Hilo and West Oahu, there really is no significant deferred maintenance. And when we get to the next slide that shows the deferred maintenance, you'll see that Hilo has a really small deferred maintenance. But what none of the units have is what we call a sinking fund, which is a pot of money for when there is some type of a crisis or a facilities event. So if there's a roof needs fixing, or there's a flood, or an electrical problem, or something happens, there's no money to reach in and leverage to fix it, which is how we get to where we are with the deferred maintenance. So the modest increases would be used to begin funding those accounts for Hilo and West Oahu. For the community colleges, it appears that even with a 0% tuition increase in the first year, that we can get rid of all the deferred maintenance by the end of the third year. So that would be what the goal is. At the end of 3 years, deferred maintenance for the community colleges would be POW. And then they would be able to move forward from there. So here's our current deferred maintenance backlog. For Manoa, it's $420 million. If you're a math person, you would round it up to $421 million because it's 0.5 or higher. For Hilo, $23 million, and for the community colleges, just under $60 million, which is where we are today. $502 million, almost $503 million, $500 million. It's a huge number. So here's the tuition proposal. What are we proposing? First of all, our commitment. Our commitment is to ensure access for every qualified Hawaii resident, to keep college affordable, and to invest in our facilities so that students have modern classrooms and learning facilities and safe research facilities. This proposal is part of a long-term strategy that intends to eliminate approximately $100 million from the current $500 million backlog. The $100 million is a conservative amount. Understand that this is something that would not go into effect next year, but the year after. So based on what interest rates are and how much it costs to fund bonds, we're anticipating to be able to do at least $100 million for the money to deal with the maintenance backlog over 3 years beginning in 2017, 2018. So fall of 2017 and 2018. So this is the proposal. It's a 3-year tuition schedule. We felt comfortable only going out 3 years with between 0 and 2% increases. The 0% is going to be the community college and the Hilo and West Oahu for the first year, and then it would go up to 2% maximum increase. What we decided about non-resident tuition, since the numbers were so much higher, is that non-resident tuition should be raised at the same dollar amount rather than percentage as the tuition is for residents. And you know, it's important to understand that, for instance, at Manoa, 2% of $10,000 or $11,000 is a lot less money than 2% of $30,000. And so that's what we have in mind. At the community colleges, it's not such a great difference. But it's meaningful to the students who are here from out of state and who are paying out of state rates. It's not the WUI rate. We're talking about out of state rates. The WUI rates would still be 150% of in-state tuition, which is what they're paying now. No increases for the professional schools at Manoa, and no increases for apprenticeship fees. This is the basic proposal. What does it look like? Because so many students go on to the 4 years, I'm going to go over it kind of briefly. But for Manoa, we're looking at a $216 a year increase for each of the 3 years, based on 12 credit hours per semester or full-time for undergraduates. For graduates, for resident, or actually both graduates, we're talking about $312 a year for each of 3 years. And then you see the non-resident, same dollar amount. Professional schools, no increases. For Hilo and actually Hilo and West Oahu are going to be the same. So I'm going to go over the West Oahu part here too. We're looking at 0% and $0 the first year, and $72 a year. Oh, this is 1%. I'm sorry, I got confused. And $72 a year in years 2 and 3, which is a 1% increase for both resident undergraduates and non-resident undergraduates. Maui College has a, I'm sorry, not graduates. Let me back up for a second. That's what happens when I try to get them confused. Okay, so resident undergraduates, $72 a year in years 2 and 3. Resident graduates at Hilo, $120 a year for years 2 and 3, $0 in the first year, which is a 1% increase. Non-resident undergraduates and graduates are the same dollar amounts. So for West Oahu, you would see, because West Oahu does not have graduate students, you would see the same increase for undergraduates. For Hilo, there's going to be $192 a year increase in years 2 and 3 for graduate nursing. And for pharmacy, they will have a $240 a year increase for all 3 years. And one of the reasons this is true is that they have some debt that they are paying off now. And the chancellor believes that they need to raise the rates for all 3 years. So as we went through West Oahu a minute ago, $72 a year increase for both residents and non-residents. When you get to the community colleges, lower division, it's just kind of elegant how the 72 kept coming up, and it was just the way it worked out. We're talking about $0 the first year, and then $72 a year increase in each of years 2 and 3, which is a 2% increase. It's a 1% increase at West Oahu and Hilo, 2% at the community colleges. Upper division, because Maui has upper division students, it's $72 a year for years 2 and 3, but this is the same rate as the West Oahu and Hilo rate, not the community college rate, even though the numbers are the same. And then the non-residents for both lower and upper division, same dollar amounts as for residents. So when we look at what it looks like over the course of the next 3 years, after 2016-17 is what the students will be paying this coming year, what it looks like at the end, you'll see that what the increases are. So for instance, at Manoa, it goes from $10,872 for a resident undergraduate to $11,520. For graduate, it goes up to $16,224, and for the undergraduate non-resident and graduate non-resident, it's still, the numbers are still high, but they go up significantly less than they would if it was a percentage. For Hilo, here are the numbers. It goes up from $7,200 a year to $7,344 for undergraduate. You see the numbers for the different programs and the graduate students, and then for the non-residents, the numbers. West Oahu numbers are the same as Hilo undergraduate. And then for the community colleges, we see the numbers go from, for residents, lower division residents from 3,024 to 3,168, for non-residents from 8,160 to 8,304. And then the upper division are the same for Hilo and West Oahu, the undergraduates. So if we do this, how will we compare at the end of 3 years with our comparison group? We've done a time series analysis to the best of our ability to project where we're going. And when we look at, so this is Manoa, the red bar at the bottom is flagship resident, so the resident down here. The dotted line is the Witchy median, and the yellow line is the Manoa resident, and up at the top, same distinction, different colors for the non-resident students. And so when we look at undergraduate tuition, we expect at the end of 3 years that we will be very close to where our comparison groups are for resident, and much more closely aligned, particularly with the Witchy median for our non-resident undergraduates. When you look at graduate tuition and fees, this is where the numbers get pretty scary, particularly when you look at the non-resident graduate, because you see the top line is Manoa, and the other lines are the flagship and the Witchy median. Again, remembering that many of our students don't pay these rates because they're coming over from out of state to study in programs where they're given graduate assistantships. I don't mean to downplay it, but it's important to keep it in a context. We see that the graduate tuition at the end of the 3 years is a little more closely aligned, still higher, but a little more closely aligned with what we expect will be happening throughout the institutions who are our comparators. When you look at Hilo, again, for resident, we expect to be spot on at the end of 3 years. For resident, non-resident, still going to be higher, but more closely aligned. For graduate, Hilo graduate, we expect our resident will still be a little bit higher, but a little more closely aligned at the end of the 3 years. For residents, non-residents will still be higher, but also more closely aligned at the end of the 3 years. West Oahu, same thing. We expect at the end of 3 years to be pretty much spot on or even slightly lower than what our Witchy comparators are for residents, and our non-residents will still be higher, but much more closely aligned than where we started. And then for community colleges, we're slightly below what our comparison groups are now, and we expect to stay below for residents and for non-residents. So when we move forward with the tuition proposal assumptions, what are some of the things we're thinking about? Well, first of all, revenue is directly linked to enrollment. So the more students you have, the more revenue you have coming into the institution. Enrollment drops, you have less revenue that comes into the institution. We anticipate nationally that enrollments are going to drop. That's just what the national trend is right now. Fewer college-age students going to college, robust economies in some areas are keeping students out of school and in the workforce. And you're thinking, well, this is Hawaii, you know, we don't always do what the rest of the country does. they come and they take our students. So we're going to have to get very aggressive at keeping our students. But if numbers go down, then the revenue is going to go down. What we've said to the units is you will hold your enrollment numbers steady. And if your enrollment goes down, you've got to figure it out. You've got to figure out how to meet your operating costs based on less money, because you're not going to touch this money, is what we're telling them. So, and we'll go through in a few minutes how much money we expect to get. So fluctuations in enrollments will be handled within the campus budgets. Institutional aid will be maintained at the current percentage levels, and that the additional revenues generated through these modest increases will be used only to address deferred maintenance backlogs. The last assumption is an important one. It's that the assumption that we will have revenue bond authority, we will get revenue bond authority from the legislature. That doesn't have to happen immediately. If we start collecting these revenues in 2017, we would need revenue bond authority by 2018 to start working on it. So it's not something that has to happen immediately, although we're working on it. But evidently there are other ways to leverage this money if we don't get revenue bond authority. We can leverage this money in other ways to make the changes, some of the changes that we need to make. So as we move forward with what we think we're going to get from this, I know this is a lot of numbers, but we're holding enrollment constant. I'm going to use Manoa and then I'll go to the community colleges. For Manoa, the enrollment numbers are being held at 33,565. With a 2% resident increase, when you take tuition net of waivers minus scholarships, you get to net tuition revenue and then the change in revenue. And what we see is we expect that these modest increases will generate an extra $2.36 million a year. So at the end of 3 years, we'll have an extra $7 million to be put towards revenue bonds for deferred maintenance. My understanding is, based on very conservative calculations, this will buy us about $90 million in revenue bonds to make changes. It's not going to be huge changes. Remember, there's over $400 million in deferred maintenance, but it will be a meaningful contribution. So for Hilo, at the end, we would expect that they would have about $500,000 in a sinking fund. West Oahu would have about $250,000 in a sinking fund. Not a lot of money, but it's a start. Community colleges would be able to generate $2.6 million, which would be used to purchase about $60 million in revenue bonds. Just remember, we saw the numbers up there. And at the end, they're done. They're done with deferred maintenance. Now, I've been telling people, I told the student caucuses, this doesn't mean that Hawaiʻi Community College is going to be a beautiful place after this. Doesn't mean we're going to get rid of, this is not for new buildings. This is not new buildings, new projects. This is to fix what we already have. So the summary is that we're looking at a 3-year tuition schedule from 2017, fall of 2017, academic year 2017-18 to 2019-20. With 0% to 2% maximum increases. Non-resident tuition increases will be the same amount as resident tuition. No increases for professional schools at Manoa. No increases for apprenticeship fees. And tuition revenues will be used only to address deferred maintenance. So to review very quickly, this is where we are. We're at the proposal distribution public meetings. We'll take it to revisions in May, and then it will come to the board in spring for some type of action based on where we've gotten. If you think of things later, after today, that you want to give us feedback on, there's both an email and a website that you can give us feedback or ideas, thoughts. So this is the proposal. I'm very thrilled that you guys are here, because the point of these meetings is to get feedback and ideas. If there are questions that need to be clarified, I'm happy to answer them. And if you'd like to let us know what you think, that would be greatly appreciated.